Today we are doing an oral history narrative interview for Ms. Carol Thompson Cole. We are in her offices of Venture Philanthropy Partners, known as VPP, in Northwest DC. Ms. Thompson Cole has been the president and CEO of VPP for about the last 12 years. VPP is an organization that invests in bright futures for young people who live in the greater Washington area, and we will talk about that more later. This interview is on behalf of the DC Oral History Collaborative and Asbury United Methodist Church. My name is Pandit Wright, and Carol, we thank you so much for inviting us here today and for being willing to share your story.
Oh, I thank you very much for asking me to share my story. I've been a lifelong member of Asbury Church, and it has been interwoven throughout my life.
And you are a native Washingtonian. We want to start with those two facts, that you are a native Washingtonian and that you are a lifelong Asburyan. What do those two things mean to you?
They are very important to me. So I guess I really thought about how important Washington was to me when I went off to college. And I went to Smith College, and I got there and people would say, "Where are you from?" My family had just moved to Silver Spring, Maryland, and I would say, "I live in Silver Spring, Maryland, but I'm from Washington, D.C." And then people would say, "But people don't live in Washington, D.C. I know where the monuments are, but I didn't see houses." And I started to say to people, "Well, I grew up in a town like everyone else. I mean, we have neighborhoods and communities just like you do." But I realized how much people identify with Washington as the nation's capital, and I became an advocate for my hometown and thought a lot about why it was important to me.
Let's talk about some of those neighborhoods, because from your childhood neighborhood, you've been in some of the neighborhoods that right now are the most highly gentrified that we have in District of Columbia. So your home neighborhood was Columbia Heights, where you were for the first 4 years of your life.
For the first 4 years of my life, we lived with my grandparents, my father's parents, at 753 Park Road. And so, yes, I'm not sure if it's exactly Columbia Heights, but it's in that area. And then we moved right about my 4th birthday to Petworth, to Emerson Street Northwest. And we stayed there until my family moved to Silver Spring, Maryland.
When I was doing some research and I looked at the various addresses, it strikes me how the neighborhoods now have multiple names. So they'll call it 16th Street Heights dash Crestwood dash Brightwood Park. That's how they describe Emerson Street. And then after college, when you came back, you were in the Logan Circle Shaw area. That's on correct. Vermont Avenue. And now you're in what they call Adams Morgan / Kalorama.
That's right.
Talk a little bit about the changes that you've seen in some of these neighborhoods that you've lived in.
Wow. Well, when I grew up in Washington, our city was very segregated. And so living on Park Road, and it was an African-American community at that point. Most of the people had been there for many years. There was a connection to Howard University because many people had Howard students living in their homes. But it was clearly, you knew you were in an African-American community. When we moved to Petworth, Petworth was transitioning from a white community, and we were early African Americans that moved into that neighborhood. So that was when I was 4 years old, and by the time I was in high school, I think maybe we had 3 or 4 white families in our entire block, and our neighborhood had changed considerably.
That's the Emerson Street address.
That's the Emerson Street address. And so when I came back from college, I moved. I was with my family in Silver Spring, but I wanted to go back to DC. And 2 of my friends from college, one of them found a place on Logan Circle. And when I moved into that community, that would have been coming back to DC in 1975. It was very much an African-American community, and over the next 3 years, I watched the disappearance of African-American families on that block. You know, when we first got there were black kids playing on the street, and then there were more young people like myself that were moving into they were big houses that were being converted into multiple dwellings. Many of them were becoming condominiums. Other whites were coming in and renovating. And so I saw the change in the community significantly at that point. And the neighborhoods now, at this point in my life, are turning back. You know, whites are moving back in significant numbers. And so where I live now on Belmont Road, I helped to gentrify that apartment building. And now I'm an older tenant, and most of the residents are younger whites moving in.
So at the time, before you made your choice about where you were going to go to college, you talk about being in a segregated neighborhood. What was the school situation like? What do you remember about your earliest elementary school days?
My early elementary days, I think the movement of whites further out of the center part of the city had already taken place. So elementary, junior high school, and high school, I was in school with African American children.
And what schools?
I went to Barnard Elementary, Bertie Backus Junior High School, and Theodore Roosevelt High School.
And then Smith.
And then I went off to Smith College.
Why did you choose Smith?
I think Smith College chose me. I really had plans to go to Oberlin, and I was accepted at Oberlin. But my parents, my father particularly, the history of my family, they've worked in catering and food service, and my grandparents worked at the White House. And so they had served, and they got to know multiple races served. And so my father was, I think he saw many women who had gone to at the time called Seven Sisters colleges. And he thought that that would be something good for me. It would provide me opportunity and access that we had not had. And so he was very determined that I would go to one of those schools. And so I applied to Smith College. I did get in, and everyone was so excited that I got into Smith that there was a lot of pressure for me not to go to Oberlin, but to go to Smith. I went kicking and screaming, but it was probably one of the best decisions I ever made.
Were your parents Washingtonians as well?
My father is a Washingtonian, but my mother came to Washington when she was in high school from Columbia, South Carolina.
So did you spend time between the South and, well, first of all, do you consider Washington to be the South?
I did not consider Washington to be the South until I went to college, and people started telling me I had a Southern accent. And then I started to interact with people of different, from different parts of the country. And I realized one of the nice things about Washington is at that point we still had a lot of charm of a southern city. But I didn't appreciate that until I was out of the city.
So why was Smith such a good decision as you just described it?
It was tough. As I said, I grew up and I'm a graduate of DC Public Schools. I think DC Public Schools prepared me well, but I didn't realize what I didn't know and what I had to work on until I got to Smith College. So while I had a great English teacher, Mrs. Butler, who told me I needed to work on my writing, I realized how much more I had to do with my writing when I got to Smith College. I always tell the story in many of my speeches that my first exam at Smith College was really traumatic. I got my blue book, I got the exam questions, and I didn't know what to do with them. And so I sat there and I wrote what I thought based on each one. And then I called my parents that day and said, maybe I don't belong here. And they said, you belong there. They wouldn't have accepted you. Go see the professor. Went to the professor said, you are very smart, but you were taught by rote, and you now have to think. And I went for a full semester. She's deceased now, but Professor Patterson worked with me and taught me how to critically think. And I tell my staff and everyone else, I'm one of the best critical thinkers you'll find now as a result of that. And I think if I had gone to another school, I'm not sure they would have had the resources or taken the time to develop me and really build on my assets and strengths to get me to the success that I've been able to have over my life.
So this was about 1970?
I went to Smith in 1969.
69. Did you feel like you were a product of affirmative action? Did that ever even cross your mind?
I think I knew that going in, but you remind me of sitting at the dinner table with other African American women from Smith who talked about, you really don't have to work hard here because we came as a result of affirmative action. And I remember saying what I truly believed and still believe is that law may have gotten me here, but I'm going to do the best I can, get the most out of this place because I deserve to be here. And I said that when I was struggling academically. And, you know, I got through Smith. I may not have had the grade point average that I had hoped to have, but I did well. I held my own. And I would say when I was at Smith, I'm going to come back and be a graduation speaker one day. And I was on the Smith College board. And I have done many things as a part of Smith and working with women of color to make sure that they feel more comfortable than I did when I was at Smith College.
So you've had the opportunity then to go on to graduate school. Did you go directly through to graduate school, or did you come back to DC in the meantime?
No, I went directly to graduate school. I left Smith and went to New York University, two very different places. I got to NYU and felt like I could do anything because of the rigor and the discipline and the confidence that I gained at Smith College.
So then you decided, though, I am coming back to the District of Columbia. Did you always know you were going to come back, or did you flirt with staying in New York?
No, when I left high school, I didn't think I was coming back to Washington because I knew the world wouldn't be segregated. And I was like, I want to go a place where it's really preparing and ready for me to be a player in the community. And I wasn't sure at that point Washington was that place.
May I just ask you, I'll just interject, the riots were going on before you left. What was the effect of that on you?
It had a great effect on me. 1968 riots, I started to realize that America wasn't really accepting of me and my community, my race. And so it changed the way I thought. So when I was planning to go to college, I wanted to go into the Foreign Service. I truly believed in democratic principles as I do today. And I said, I want to go spread that around the world. Then I got to college. Then I went through the late 60s, the early 70s, and all that came with it. And I'm like, no, I'm going back home, and I'm going to make sure that my community accepts and prepares, and we all feel like we have opportunity to be the best people we can be. And that's kind of the way I've lived my life.
So how did you begin to make career choices? So I just need to say, your career is so distinguished in many sectors. You've had private sector experience, city government, federal government as advisor to President Clinton. You worked lobbyist for a large Fortune 500. You owned your own consulting business, and now, of course, president and CEO of VPP. Are you a planner? Were you checking off boxes, or how did these things happen?
I think I've always had values and ideals that I believed in and wanted to fight for. And then I met people that saw something in me and helped to open doors and push me to reach my potential. And so Asbury plays a big role in that. I don't know whether you can ask me questions, but you know, I think about and have thought as I've prepared for this of my family. And you know, Asbury was a safe place for us to be in community regardless of what was going on in community.
You were christened at Asbury.
I was christened at Asbury. My grandfather, Leon Thompson, would go around and pick up his grandchildren. To this day, I don't know how we all fit in that small car.
How many were you?
Wow. Well, so in my family, over time, it's 6. And one of the families, the Marshall family, there were 8. And then there were the Madisons, there were 2. And so he would pick us up, whoever was going. We got in that car and we went to church. And he made sure that we had the worship service experience, the Sunday school experience, and the bonding experience of us as a family. I think we understood about respecting and honoring our elders and getting along and having a strong family bond. And that was the Sunday experience.
We always happened even when you were in Silver Spring?
No, that he was deceased, and when we went to Silver Spring, we moved from Asbury to a church, Marvin Memorial United Methodist Church, which has got a new name. I just happened to go by, that's Colesville Road and University Boulevard, and I said, oh, that's not the same name church. But no,
was the beginning.
Asbury was the beginning. Asbury was the beginning values, and that was throughout, from the time I was probably preschool through high school. My grandfather passed when I was in the 6th grade, but members of our family picked up that tradition that we had. And I think we all started moving out of the city into the suburbs as I was graduating and going to college. So it was very interesting. The rule in our family was if you didn't go to church, then you didn't get to do things that you wanted to do the next weekend. So all of us figured out we were going to church, but so we could do things. I think for me, it just became so much a part of me. So when I got to Smith College, we had Helen Hills Chapel, and there was a very ecumenical service that we had. And I got to church. There were very few African Americans that went to the church. I got there, and after a couple of Sundays, that was not the church experience that I had. They sang in Latin most of the time, and I was like, okay, I'm here. But at that point, you couldn't take a car to church. I was in Northampton, Massachusetts, and you'd have to go to Springfield to go to church. So most of the African Americans would probably go to church 2 to 3 times a year when they would have a special service for African Americans, or a gospel service, or a speaker. But I reached a point with the academic issues that I was facing and just being in a very different environment in Massachusetts that I set aside time every week and went and sat in the chapel just to be at peace and to be with my God. And one day a woman came out and she said to me, Reverend Unsworth would like to see you. And I went back with her, and he said, I understand you come here once a week, and why do you come? And I told him because I need that peace, and I need to really pray and just be with myself. And so he said, how about if we have time together? And so Reverend Unsworth became one of the most important people in my time at Smith College because he helped fulfill that spiritual nurturing that I needed. And I also came to appreciate my Asbury experience because it was not there to get that experience during that period of time. So that helped sustain me over the 4 years. And also during the 4 years, with all that was going on and civil rights and just activism, student activism, I wanted to go to Mississippi for a summer, and I was able to get the chapel to actually pay for me to have that experience, which was very important. So I realized how important, church faith was and how important Asbury was to me as a person. So when I came back to Washington, I lived, as you said, I lived in Logan Circle, and every Sunday I would just walk to Asbury, and I became very reconnected with Asbury and with my church tradition.
Let's talk about some of the roles that you played within Asbury and the contributions that you have made. The same way Asbury has been important in your life, you have been important in the life of the church.
So I would say the importance of the church to me, they don't have it now, but Methodist Youth Fellowship was important, and we went to our worship service in the morning, and most of the time we would come back Sunday evening for MYF. And so that was important. I think of my Sunday school teachers and the head of the Sunday school, how they really made sure that we were doing well in school as well as doing well at church and being engaged in the church. I think we got opportunities for speaking and being presenters through the church. So a lot of my confidence in myself came out of Asbury. So coming back, the first way I really got engaged was through United Methodist Women. And I was one of the younger women that was involved. And so people kept saying, why don't you be in charge of this program, or why don't you do that? And so I would be in the church on Sunday as well as on Saturday.
Can you talk a little bit about United Methodist Women for those who may hear this story one day and not know what that is? What is the purpose and the goal?
So United Methodist Women comes out of the denomination broadly, and each church has their unit. It is still very active. Deidre Ford actually came to me and said, we want more young women to be involved because we want to be involved in, I think the communion of women and service. And so we started, at the time it was Group 11, which was a younger group of women, and then we decided we wanted to bring older women to join us and not just be a younger group of women in the organization. So it was about giving back to community, meeting needs around the world, but supporting ourselves in our spiritual journey.
And what other things have you done in Asbury that are meaningful to you now as you think about it?
Probably there are two things that are very meaningful to me. One is when I was in government, one of the things that I was involved in was historic preservation. So I was the state historic preservation officer, and I had heard conversations about the historic things that have happened at Asbury over time. And I asked, are we a historic landmark? And I found out that we had not, but there had been interest in archives and just generally about us getting a local designation and a National Register designation. So a committee was put together that I was part of, and we did prepare the application for both designations. And over time, we gathered information, and it really kind of started a stronger archives and recording Asbury's history, which goes on until today. And so I was involved in that and got to learn more about members of our church and the contributions of our church in our community.
Is there anything that you would share about Asbury's history that most people don't know?
Wow. Right off, I can't. I mean, I always think about, I'm not thinking of anything right at the moment.
Let's just think about somebody. Is there a story about anyone in the church with whom you particularly connected, or just something funny, or just something that we don't know?
Well, I think one of the connections is the Eaton family and the Nero family, the Banks family, the Thompson family. Many of the members of these families were involved in the church, and they were involved in education and politics. And so my father and David Eaton were among the first altar boys in the church. And Reverend Eaton was at, the church at 16th and Harvard.
I don't know. Not the...
I'll think of it in a minute.
The one that's on night...
It's a Unitarian church.
Oh,
it's a Unitarian church that was very active in All Souls Unitarian Church. And so he was involved in local politics, and he was on the school board. And so his family was important. He was actually my brother Alexander's godfather. And so following him had a lot to do with me being conscious and wanting to be active in community. And so he made a significant contribution to our city over time. And then many of our women were teachers, women and men actually, were teachers in DC public schools. And actually Mrs. Foy was at Bertie Backus Junior High School, and she was my home economics teacher.
She was the wife
of Reverend Foy, who was there in the 50s, early 60s, I would imagine. So, you knew that people were in the community. You would see them in the news, and then Asbury's been a gathering place, to this day. Meetings are held at our church. We welcome other congregations. So there are a lot of things that have happened there over the years.
So we're going to talk more about Asbury as we return, and then we'll go more into your career. Speaking of Asbury and just other roles that you've held in the church, can we talk a bit about Asbury Dwellings and the very important work that you did there?
Yes. So Asbury Dwellings came about because Reverend Williams had a relationship with the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and we were able through them to get a designation to sponsor a senior citizen facility. Time was running out and we had not found that facility, and so I'm not sure who came to DC government, but at the time I was working in the Department of Housing and Community Development. This was in the early 80s. And so I remember members of the church showing up for this meeting, and I said to my boss, "This is my church, can I sit in the meeting?" And we heard about the fact that, you know, we needed to find property or the monies from HUD were going to go away. And so through the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, several properties were identified. And Asbury Dwellings, which was an abandoned school, was the old Shaw Junior High School, became the designated site for Asbury Dwellings. And so over time, I helped them from the inside as a government employee to get everything in order for us to get that building. What was exciting about it is the neighborhood it was in is not that far from our church and part of our history. And also, we were able to do the first adaptive reuse of a school into residences. And so that was something that was new and different and exciting. So I was asked one day if I could come on the board of Asbury Dwellings, and so I worked with the lawyers in the department, and they said as long as you keep the lines in the right place, there's no problem with you doing that. And so I worked very closely with Harold Tinsley, who was the head of the board at that time, and mostly the members, the officers of different officers were on the board, and then everybody on the board had an affiliation with the Board of Asbury Dwellings. And we had DeLong Harris as our attorney, who was also a member of the church, and then Flaxie Pinkett, her company became our management company. And so we had a very exciting project, a very complicated project in turning this building into senior housing, and we had a very early good history and it being a very solid project here in the District of Columbia.
So you're managing construction, design, accessibility, everything.
I was working on those issues and had no real experience in any of them. I was gaining it in my career, and Asbury gave me the opportunity to see it play out.
Excellent.
And I would also say that many years later, after I became the president of the board, and I stayed president of the board until I became the city administrator in Washington, D.C. Didn't have the time to commit, and so worked with the board in that transition period. And then if you fast forward, we got probably about 12 years ago, one morning our phone rang. By then I was married to Curtis Cole, Jr., and we got a phone call from Reverend Shockley. And he indicated that we had some issues with Asbury Dwellings in terms of, the physical condition of the building and just some concerns about management. And he asked if that was something that I would help him and members of the church figure out. And I said to him at the time, I'm willing to do that, but my husband needs to come along with me on this project because this is his business and he knows how to do this. And so we were surprised at just what had happened over time. And I will say, with all due respect, with members aging in positions and regulations and rules and neighborhoods changing and HUD officials and administrations changing, that we lost the edge and the prominence that we had. But we were determined that we were going to maintain that property. And so Curtis, and I thank him for it, he allowed one of our employees at Curtex Construction to become dedicated to really figuring out and solving the puzzle, to figure out where things were and what needed to be done, and to help us get it back into place. And so what I wanted to indicate is that, you know, Curtis and I take great pride in the turnaround of Asbury Dwellings, and it was a much more complicated project than we anticipated, and we were able to subdivide the gym from the senior apartments because the gym was not in good order, but as long as it was connected to Asbury Dwellings, when we had inspections and the like, it took off points would put the residents at risk. So just separating the two properties was important. And then we were able to, through Curtis's contacts, to arrange refinancing for $4 million for the renovations. And then we were able to obtain grants and other buyouts to do an additional $1.5 million worth of renovations in 1 year. I think most proud is the fact that we did not move any tenants out of their units. And so people had to move out for the day at 2 different points in time so we could get everything put back in, but no one had to leave the building. And as you know, that's when people have to move out, they don't always come back.
How many tenants in the building?
I'm not sure of the exact number, but I think it's either 147 or 167 units. I get it confused with our apartment building we live in today. But we were able to work that out and work with the board and work with the church to make sure that that building is a real pride for us at this point in time. And we had to do a lot of repointing of the building. But you know, when I was a kid, this building was known as Terrible Shaw, and so it's a building that people know and one of the most successful senior citizen residences in the city.
What's the address?
It's technically 1616 Marion Street Northwest, but it's at the corner of 7th and Rhode Island Avenue Northwest.
Wonderful.
So that's probably one of my prides, to be able to help us get it. And it's been, I think, one of our strongest ministries through the church.
Now, with accomplishments like that, it must be very easy for every new minister that comes to reach out to you and ask you to help with new initiatives. Can you just briefly talk about 1 or 2 of the initiatives in most recent years that you have been and are still involved with?
Yeah. So, yes, they reach out, and then there are times that I come back and ask if I can help. So most people know that since I married, my husband and I live in Norfolk, Virginia, and in Washington, D.C. And one of the hard points for me is when we got married, Curtis was not going to stay affiliated with the church that he was in because of them not doing the things for his mother as she aged as he had hoped. And so we started to look for a new church home for both of us. And we found one in Bank Street Memorial Baptist Church in Norfolk, which also is a historic church. So they kept saying, Carol, you're getting active in the church and you all are here all the time, become members. And I would say to them, I can't give up my membership at Asbury United Methodist Church in Washington. So my grandfather actually said to me, you can become a member of a church under watch care. So Curtis fully joined the church, and I'm a member under watch care. And I started being involved in that church and helped them with the out-of-school time program. And then I said, I need to do something with Asbury. So I always find my way to the pastor and say, you're not going to see me in church that much because most weekends I'm at another church in Norfolk, Virginia, but how can I participate? And so in the last couple of years, we've been looking at the changes in Asbury, and we did a strategic planning process, and I was part of that effort. I chaired a committee that you were on and many others. We made sure that were people who had been in Asbury for a long time, lifelong members, new members, people who have been active but have not joined. So we could really do an assessment of what are the issues, what are the needs, and how do we make sure that Asbury has a ministry that's meeting the needs of its members, but also reaching outside of the church to bring people in and serve the community. We have a very rich history with what we're doing now with homeless people. I remember years ago when prostitution in the neighborhood of the church was big, our members were out there and reaching out and making sure that they were no longer in our neighborhood and around our church. So looking at what are the programs that will meet the needs of community and the church. So we developed a strategic plan, and there are efforts to continue to move that plan forward. So I've been involved with our church council.
So now switching gears a bit, let's talk about that illustrious career. So how did you decide on the first job you were going to take when you came out of college?
So I wasn't sure when I left graduate school. I actually knew when I left college I was coming back to DC. And the question was, what would I do?
Because your master's was in public administration.
My master's was in public administration. I thought I was going to be a lawyer, but I really didn't want to practice law. And so I went to the mailbox one day and I had 2 stacks. I ended up putting the public administration in the mail and took the law school ones back. And so I went to NYU. They asked me to stay in New York, but I was like, number one, how do you teach public administration if you haven't done it? So I said, I got to go and do something, and then maybe later in my career I'll come back and talk to you about teaching. And I had a professor in college that was active in DC politics, and he actually was working with Marion Barry when he was on the council, and then he ran his campaign. And the night that Marion won the first primary, I got a call and he said, we won. He said, you told me you were coming back home and you were going to do something important with your life, so why don't you come into government with us? And I said, you're too late. And he says, what do you mean we're too late? I said, I accepted a job to go to San Francisco with the HUD regional office, and so I can't come in with you. And his name is Ivanhoe Donaldson, he's deceased now, and he said, all that you talked about you were going to do in Washington, how can you go to San Francisco? And so I did not sleep that night. My family was not supportive of me going to San Francisco. So the next morning I called Emma McFarland, who was the regional administrator at the time, and I said, you're not going to be very happy with me, but I'm going to stay home. I've got an opportunity to go into a new administration, and really some of the things I'd like to see happen for my city, I'll have the opportunity to accomplish. And she said, you're right, I don't like it, but people don't get opportunities like that, so I wish you good luck. And so I got involved with the mayor's transition, and then actually they had a program where I could go to city government and not give up my government position to see if it was going to work out. And so about 6 months after I was there, they knew and I knew I wasn't going back to the federal government, and I became a staff person at the Department of Housing and Community Development.
Of the things that you accomplished over those next 12 years, what are you most proud of?
I'm proud of my work with the Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs. I realized that I'm a good manager of people, and I can inspire people and get them to do things and help them to develop their careers. And I learned that in doing a reorganization of 4 small agencies and then parts of larger agencies and creating DCRA. It has not been as smooth of a history for that agency as I had hoped, but it allowed me to see that I'm a manager of people and for me to have greater opportunity by the things that I accomplished in that department. So that was a great opportunity for me. But I think that the work that I did when I moved to City Hall, and I was in the mayor's office as his chief of staff, and I was able to bring some of the improvements that I made at the department level into a citywide level, because employees, when they knew I was going to City Hall, they would say, can you do some of the things in my department that you did at DCRA, DLI, and I? And so we got some of those accomplished. I think being the deputy mayor for economic development was critical because of what was going on in the city downtown.
Paint us a picture of what DC, give us the years and what the district was like at that time.
Okay, so I went to DC government in 1979, and so it was still a city with a lot of vacant properties, a lot of neighborhoods that had been disinvested in. It was a lot of, the schools were not in the best shape. And so I think the thing that was so hard is we went into the government full of ideas and energy to turn the city around, and we realized that the city had serious deficits, that the city would go bankrupt at a period of time if we couldn't figure out how to improve the systems of finance and bring in resources to the city. So it was a very tough period of time being in the government, but it was people who believed in the city, and we worked hard to turn it around. I think many things that we worked on and did the design on actually came into fruition after we left the government. I take great pride, and I say to people from time to time, I actually helped create that. And I know whoever is the mayor at the time gets the credit, and that's fine, but we laid the groundwork for a lot of very positive things to happen.
Is there an example you want to share of that?
I think some of it is some of the development projects in different communities like Shaw, downtown. There was a real rebirth of downtown Washington during the 12 years that I was in city government. I remember being at I'm not sure what it's called now, but where the National Press Building is, the block between 14th, 13th, East Street and F Street. I mean, those were old buildings, very decrepit. That was a major project. And most of downtown was revitalized during the time that I was in city government. And I was very much a part of those discussions.
And that is something that, do you feel that these are still the after effects of what you experienced in 1968?
Oh, yes. I feel very strongly. So you look at 14th Street today. So when I was a kid, I took ballet at Jones Hayward School of Ballet, and I would get my toe shoes on 14th Street. And we didn't have to go to the suburbs because we had 14th Street, 8th Street, we had downtown stores. The riots really killed those corridors. And I tell people it took 40 years to rebuild and transform those communities. And so you're looking at Southwest Washington, you know, Shaw. And so it's now gone to a whole nother level with more redevelopment and newer people coming into the city. But we persevered, and we put a lot of policies in place, and a lot of things happened. So one of the big issues was we were still very much under the control of the federal government when I was in city government. So we had to get their approval. All of those things have changed. They have input, but we're much more independent. And the money that we get into the city through taxes can be put into our neighborhoods and our cities. So we've come a long way.
At what point were you appointed city administrator, the only woman, I believe, to be appointed city administrator?
I was appointed city administrator, that would have been in 1988. So when I went to City Hall, I started out as the mayor's chief of staff, and it was right at the time that he was ending his second term to begin his third term. And he said to me, will you stay and be my chief of staff? And I said, no, I'd like to go back to the programs that I know, because I came from HUD to the federal district government. So he said, which job do you want? And I said, I want to be the deputy mayor for economic development. And he kind of looked at me, and at that time, a whole lot of people wanted that job. And I said, well, I've worked at DCRA, I've worked at, I know the regulatory side, I know the program side, and we need to really build relationships with the business community. And I feel I have the skills and the knowledge to do that. And I was in that position for 1 full year. And I think I did, with my team and with the mayor's office, we really did get the business community to come on board and really work with us and be in partnership in a lot of the revitalization that was going on in the city. So I feel good about that. And when I became city administrator, it was during a very tough time. I say the office of the city administrator, everything internally and externally comes to your desk. And so you have to look at, I was city administrator at a point when homelessness was really getting out of hand, and we started to have homeless women and families, and we really weren't prepared to take care of that. And so I had to deal with issues of, you do not put women and children in homeless shelters, which were in schools and in vacant properties and with men. And so we took quite a beating for getting hotels to take families, and the hotels would reach a point that they would say, we have so many homeless people that we can't get people to come in and rent rooms for the hotel. So we ended up taking over, and there were a lot of issues that came with that, and a lot of people thought that we didn't know what we were doing. We were responding to the issues that were facing us, and we had to adapt as we went. And so we took a lot of criticism for that, but that was happening at levels, and we were more compassionate as a government and as a city. Many cities would just say, no, you just find your way, or you go on the street, or they would take people and put them in kind of bullpens out of the way of people seeing them. And we weren't dealing with it that way. But those were very hard issues. At that point, the crack epidemic hit. People started having babies and leaving them, and so border babies, kids were staying at DC General Hospital, and the mother would leave. So we had all kinds of really hard human services and economic development issues hit at one time that we had to navigate. And I think that I brought some order and discipline and to some extent a competency that people felt comfortable with at the time I was leading the city government in tough times.
You were also, were you there for when we had the amazing, the jobs program for teenagers that came online?
We had, that was one of the programs that Mayor Barry did at the beginning. Probably one of the first programs we spent a lot of time. A lot of our kids weren't getting jobs. Not only did we have a federal program, but we started a local program so that middle income kids also had the opportunity to get jobs in our city, and we were able to put our local revenues into that program. There were issues sometimes with the administration of the programs, but I meet so many young people or younger adults who tell me that they got their start based on the youth employment program, which is now named after Mayor Barry.
What was your decision to leave city government? What was happening with you that you thought it's time, or did somebody just reach in and get you?
So I had been in the government for 3 terms, and as you know, the mayor had personal problems that I was there responsible in juggling all of that at the time. And so for me, it was time to do something else. I also, because of the different issues that I described, I realized that we couldn't solve those issues alone in government. And one of the projects that I worked on as the deputy mayor for economic development was trying to create a downtown partnership. And I laughed because DC was criticized a lot, but it was for us trying to solve problems that were not easy to solve. And so now people know business improvement districts, and we have several business improvement districts in DC, and they have them all over the country. So we started and we went through the tuggle of how do you get business people to respect government people and vice versa? How do they understand that we work hard every day on the issues and we don't have the resources to solve them? And so I think when the whole concept really broke through was in New York, when a lot of money by government and business was put in to the Times Square Business Improvement District. But we were the first.
Districts are different from empowerment zones?
Yes, business improvement districts were neighborhoods where businesses were willing to pay taxes that would help to go into improvements in their communities that the government could not support, but they had to do it in partnership with the government. And so we now have several very successful business improvement districts here, and like I said, they are all over the country. But we went through the struggle of trying to understand that we may mean the same thing and have the same goals, but we weren't talking the same language, and we didn't appreciate the limitations that were on each of us as sectors.
What do you think of when you just think about companies like Amazon coming in now? Did you ever foresee such a thing happening when you were mayor?
DC has always been a place that everybody wanted to come. And so I think my struggle then and now is how do we take care of the least among us while we look at really improving and bringing the resources that need to come. So I'm very happy that Amazon is coming to our community, but it has to be a benefit to the entire region. And we also have to think about the impact of a large employer like that coming in, and what does it do to the people that live in those communities? What does it do to the people that are coming in? How do we make sure that the young people throughout this region are prepared for jobs that they're going to have? And so it's not just being so happy that any and everything they want is done, but that we blend to make the best out of what we have and make it better by what they bring.
We will talk more about that as we continue. So before we move to your time spent with President Clinton and that administration, I wanted to ask you your thoughts on the other side about gentrification. We talked about neighborhoods that you grew up in, neighborhoods that you lived in when you returned to the district. However, some gentrification was planned. We're calling for it. What are your thoughts about it now, as you think professionally as well as personally?
I think it's hard to stop progress, but I think you have to figure out how to manage it. And so I use the experience of actually the time I worked in the Clinton White House, because at that point in time, we were really struggling with the city's finances, and the control board had just been put in place, and we needed to really look at, analyze the district situation and figure out how do we generate money, how would the city not go bankrupt. So we knew that had to take place. But I think that when I look at the plan that was developed, and it was developed between the federal government and the local government, which I think is very important, one of the things that surprised me about my time at the White House is that I planned a big meeting with the president, and I was amazed at the number of business leaders and civic leaders that told me they had never been in the White House before. And so here, for me, what I love about Washington and why I've stayed here and stayed engaged is I love Washington in all its dimensions. I think it makes our city so rich to be able to have a local community be the nation's capital, be the capital of the free world. But we don't figure out how to bring the pieces together and leverage the strengths of them for the entire community to benefit. And so in working with the government from the White House, we were so busy trying to save our city that in developing it and looking at how many people did you need to bring into the city, what income levels did you need to bring in, we really didn't carve out and focus on our most vulnerable people. And so a lot of why I do what I do today is how do I make sure that that doesn't get lost again? And that's the work we do here at Venture Philanthropy Partners. And so gentrification is going to happen, but you don't have to have everybody moving out of their communities, and you don't lose the culture of Washington and its neighborhoods, which is very rich.
I understand. So just picking up a little bit more of a biographical thread again. So you left the district, you went into the private sector at that point. You were a lobbyist and consultant for a while. Again, though, working on District of Columbia issues, environmental, internal.
Well, my work in the corporate world really was at the national and the international level. I worked for RJR Nabisco. I got criticized when the article was in the Washington Post announcing that the former city administrator was going to RJR Nabisco because it was a tobacco company. But they gave me an opportunity to be a vice president in the corporate world, which was very hard when you had had a long government history. A lot of companies like that couldn't see you translating into that.
And
I
as
wanted
a woman as well?
And I would say yes. So one of the things that I didn't realize that I actually was a diversity candidate when I was going through the process. I read it in the Washingtonian magazine one day when there was an article about placing women into senior positions, and I found out that Lou Gerstner, who was the head of RJR Nabisco, said, I want to make sure that each of the senior recruitments that you prove that you looked at a diverse pool of people. It was also interesting when the headhunter called me that they said, you know, everybody we've talked to has asked if we've talked to you, and we never thought about you, and we're embarrassed for it. But I don't think they looked in government, and I don't think they realize how much you learn. So when I was preparing for my interview, it was a vice president for government and environmental affairs. And I was like, what would I do with that job? Well, by the time I thought of, I ran the regulatory department of the city, and I know at that point in time all the regulations and everything and how business and government come together. And then, you know, being the city administrator, I had to deal with issues of water, you know, of infrastructure. So I knew more about that than I even had consciously thought of on a day-to-day basis. So I was lucky that I did get that position. But one of the reasons I wanted to go from DC government to business is I did know that it was going to take a partnership of government business working together to solve problems. They were putting money in. RJR Nabisco was very involved in education and improving K through 12 education when I was there. And they used me because I had been in the city government and worked on those issues. They brought me into meetings to bring that perspective, which was very important. So I worked in the Washington office, but luckily I worked for a company that allowed people to work on corporate issues, and we just weren't lobbyists. Yes, I did go to Capitol Hill. I did take people to the federal agencies, but I felt like I had a richer experience. So I started to understand how businesses think, where they're uncomfortable or worried that if they get too involved in government, it may hurt the business interests. So I learned a lot of those dynamics and were able to apply them back when I went to the White House to work on development of the revitalization plan for the District of Columbia.
So how did the White House opportunity come to you?
It came in a very interesting way. And so when I was in city government, we had a committee that was looking at the finances of the District of Columbia. And I had reached out for the mayor to ask Alice Rivlin to chair that committee. And so I got to know Alice very well. And we wanted to make sure that that committee was in place as we transitioned out, having been in government for 12 years, to make sure that we were helping the next mayor to come along to know and have partnerships and ways to begin to solve the problems that we had been facing. So when the Clinton administration came in and President Clinton wanted to do something significant for the District of Columbia, and they were already in this control period, Alice called up and said, what are you doing? She was no, she wasn't the head of the control board. She was actually the head of OMB. Right. Well, she was the number 2. She was Office of Management and Budget. She was the number 2 there, deputy director. And she called and she said, you know the district, you know Washington from living here. We want to do something important. Will you coordinate those efforts? And that's how I got to the White House. Little did I know that Alice was going to be leaving because she was appointed to the Federal Reserve. And so Alice and I had a very short period of time to work together, but I knew from the time I had that the president was committed and that there were opportunities for us to do something. And she had embedded me within that agency where I knew and would in meetings to hear about where resources were and how I could bring resources to the District of Columbia. We were very lucky that Frank Raines was named the next head of OMB. And as the director of OMB, I got to work with him. And Frank had been the financial advisor to the District of Columbia. So he knew and he understood in a real day-to-day way the impact on the district. And so we went much bolder and we were able to do the revitalization plan. And as I said, when I think back on it, the city that we see today is very much based on the commitments that we made and the fact that there were certain debts that were forgiven and other things put in place so the city would not go bankrupt. And so that was really very important to do. But then I realized later on that a lot of people, that's when gentrification started to really take off again, and what's going to happen and how do we deal with
at this point.
this was in the 90s, yes.
Were you having fun?
I've been lucky. I've had fun. When I don't have fun, then I start to look for what's next. So it was really funny when we started talking about transition for the next president, because I was in the second term of the Clinton administration. I said to my husband, I've done multiple transitions. I don't want to do another. And so I stepped out and I did some consulting. And actually, I worked for a group out of New York called Business Opportunities for Leadership Development. And I did consulting because they had seen the work I had done in the city, and I actually got to know them through my deputy mayor days. And I actually went and worked with them to create corporate community partnerships in Seattle, Houston, and Fort Worth. And one day I said to my husband, I'm traveling all over the country, and then 9/11 happened. And I was doing one-leg trips, and I'm like, I'm tired of this. And I'm getting searched every day, and I'm asking them, I'm not randomly searched. And they told me, because you're going from Washington to Seattle, then to Houston, you know, people do round trips. So I said, okay, it's time for me to stop doing this. And I said, what am I going to do? And I called a friend of mine who happened to be on the board of Venture Philanthropy Partners. And I said, I'm coming back to DC. I don't want to go back in government, but I want to do something really meaningful and intentional outside of government. And she said, give me a couple of days. I know where you're going. And that was in 2003. And here I am still today at Venture Philanthropy Partners. So I started as special advisor to the chairman of the board, and then I became the managing partner. And then I was asked to be president and CEO, and I've been in that position since 2007.
Why VPP?
VPP because number one, I really understood our kids were in great need. The work I did for our church in Norfolk was we had a HUD grant, and the church really didn't quite know how to implement it. And so after a sermon, my husband went up to the pastor and said, we're new members, but you need my wife to help you with the vision you just said. And so I started working with the church there, and I got to see what our most vulnerable youth were faced with, and I could not believe that the supports that I had in my community growing up were not at all what was there for kids today.
What happened?
And so what happened is I think cities were underinvested in. I think that's the big thing. When you look at, you know, the HUD programs and the like, the money wasn't put in the cities. People fled to the suburbs, and all people fled to the suburbs. I mean, anybody who could leave left. My family left. And so, you know, so I think about that, and kids, babies started having babies. You know, I mean, kids, now grandmothers are taking care of, and aunts are taking care of these kids, but it just, the social fabric just started to disintegrate. And these kids know that they need support, and they're looking for caring adults. And so I said, when I heard what VPP was about, I said to Mario Marino, our founder, I'm actually doing that kind of work on the ground in Norfolk. And I said to Curtis recently, I know how to do that in Washington. Let me figure out how to go back. And this provided me the platform to work. And so I said, I really want to see how I bring government, business, and philanthropy together and work with our most vulnerable youth. And they had already set it up to look at what are the best organizations that are serving children and youth And how do you help them serve more kids? How do you help them serve them better? And I said, I'm in. And so I came on board. It's about scaling what works.
What have been your lessons learned? I know there must be tons of them, but what sticks out in your mind, lessons learned since you became the president of this organization?
I think the first thing is that if you find the right programs and you connect kids to them, you'll be surprised at how quickly their lives start to transform. And then the question is, how do you make sure that you get them in early childhood and the programs are there for them all the way through high school and into college? And so for VPP, we first started working very eclectically with good organizations, and then we decided that we would work with early childhood. The research shows that if you get them early, they have a better life trajectory. And then you got to get the kids that are older, help them not to have as many young kids, help them get connected to the right programs. And so our work now is to be champions for career or college ready kids. So you asked the question, I went right from high school to college to work, to graduate school and to work. Most of our vulnerable youth, which are kids of color, they can't go right to college. I mean, many of them have the grades, but if they can't get the scholarships, they don't go. Or they get there the first year and people have gotten them to college, celebrated them, but don't help them persist. And so working on these issues. So I'm like, the world hasn't really changed in the way that people develop. We've got to make sure that the supports are here and they have to be provided by all of us. So for VPP, it's how do you align? A lot of money is put into community, but if you don't do it in a coordinated way, then you're not going to see the results that you can get.
So Carol, during this career, you have been representing women, you have been representing Black people. What is it like, just on the personal side, to be you during this time?
So I have to thank God and Curtis Cole Jr. because
who you met at Leadership.
Who I met. I used to say in speeches that if I don't meet him in the meeting, I won't meet him. And I met my husband in the Board of Trade conference room after I did a presentation on the city's budget. And one of my good friends, who was my attorney in city government with several other people I knew, for some reason they said, he and Carol would be a good couple. And one of them, not the one I knew, who kept saying, I've got this guy for you to meet, but another one came and said, you all need to meet. And we looked at each other, we exchanged cards as you do in DC. And every so often they would call and say, have you all met yet? And we met. And that's a funny story too. So being a woman at that point in government and not married, I had to be very careful with what and how I did things. And so my father or one of my three brothers always escorted me to events when I needed someone. And so this particular, it was the tennis match. You know, government officials always went to the first night of the tennis match. And my assistant came in and said, none of your brothers or your dad are available to take you. And my scheduler said, well, this guy, Mr. Cole, we've been talking and he's really a nice guy. So why don't you ask him to take you to the tennis tournament? And I was like, I can't do that. I don't know him. And they sat around in my office and we talked about it. I said, okay. And we met at the tennis tournament. A lot of people knew him.
Wait, tell us where the tennis tournament was.
It's at the Carter Barron.
That one, okay.
It's one at the Carter Barron.
Yeah.
So it's, so that tennis tournament. So, you know, we went to the tennis tournament. Everybody started assuming we were dating, which that was the first time we had gone out. And we had, you know, a great time with all of our friends and colleagues. And I said, I've got a ticket for the next night. Would you like to come? But we're not going to be in a box. We're going to be out in the stadium. And he said, fine. Curtis had played tennis a lot at that point. And we went to Georgetown because it started raining. And I said, I don't really want to sit in the rain. He said, I don't either. So we left and went to Georgetown. And I tell people we sat and we talked. And we've been talking ever since. And we've been married since 1990.
Wow. That is a good story. So what other goals do you have for yourself now?
So I think a goal I have for myself now is to make sure that what we've built at VPP continues. And so every nonprofit, as you know, Pandit, has to figure out a way to sustain itself. And so we were started as a new way of philanthropy with a significant amount of individual giving, which is very rare in our community. And then we've now taken on institutional and government money. So we're trying to figure out what is the next pathway for us to scale good programs throughout the Washington metropolitan area. So getting that in place along with a really strong team here. It's been amazing, the wonderful people, bright, hardworking, passionate people that I've worked with here. So continuing to get this organization on solid footing is an important goal of mine. And then to figure out how I can balance my life more, and do some of the other things that I like to do.
What else do you like to do?
Curtis and I like to travel. We like to enjoy our home in Norfolk and the community. And we're at a point, with so many people, that we're taking care of my mother and my grandfather. And I want to make sure the younger people in our family, we get to spend time with them and help them have their life opportunities as positive as we have.
Do you see retirement as a word that has any meaning whatsoever for you?
Well, I was telling someone last week who asked me a similar question. I said, when I can figure out what I'm going to do so I don't keep working and not get paid for it, then I'll think about retirement, because I will be very busy and I will not have stopped working. And so trying to figure out what the plan is and the balance, because Curtis and I will continue to live here in Washington as well as in Norfolk.
Continuing on from native Washingtonian to just be here, be in your town, be in your space. What message of hope do you have for Asburyans?
Well, when we were doing the strategic planning process, I think that the hope is to figure out how we take the assets of Asbury and look at what we need for ourselves as well as for the community that we're in, so that we can have a new strength for the future. Asbury will not be what it was, but it can still hold on to what we've been about in our community. And you see that we have a strong history of that over time, and I hope we can get it right soon for the future.
That flavor of when you were a small child to when you were a young woman to where we are today, what does Asbury feel like to you? Just every place has a physical feel. What is it for you, and can you just talk a little bit about some of those changes?
Well, I think the first thing that I've valued is the corner that we're on in Washington, D.C. To be a downtown church that, even though we struggle, but downtown churches are struggling all over the United States, is how do we stay on that corner?
Of 11th and
K. At 11th and K Northwest. And when Curtis and I were working on Asbury Dwellings, we had someone say to us, well, maybe you all should sell one of these. You're on one corner. Do you need to be on two corners? And I said, yes, we do. These are two very important corners in the history of Washington, and they've been our church and our Asbury Dwellings, and I don't see us changing that. And I think figuring out how we maintain and sustain ourselves as the city changes. I believe new people have to be welcomed, and I think we have to take care of our own.
Yes, I wonder one day if we'll all get together in this town and figure it out. Do you feel good about the new people that are coming here? Do you sense partnership opportunities? Do you see that in your work, in your either here or in Norfolk? What do you think about this new generation that is coming?
I think that they do things very differently from the way that we've done them, but I think that they have passion and are trying to find their way. So what I say as my team changes, I have to be open to doing things in a new way, but I also want them to respect the past and the history and build on it. And I think we have to figure out how we do that in the city overall. But I find that there are a lot of very smart, committed young people. Right now I'm concerned. You know, I'm seeing culture clashes in the city. You know, the go-go music being played and new residents not knowing that or valuing it and saying stop. You know, someone walking a dog on Howard University's campus. Those are things that bother me, but I think those of us that value our institutions have to speak up. We have to have conversation with these people and say, you came into our community and you should work with us because we're not going to leave easily. I think we've got to figure out how to work it out, and I think we have to figure out and develop the leaders that can navigate. And I think for me, that's what I've tried to do. You know, I knew Washington would change and I didn't want to have to leave it, so I went to a place that prepared me for living and working with different people, different races and economic classes. And I think we have to figure out how we have leadership that works on those things in our city and I think in our society generally today.
Well, Carol, I thank you very much for this time in this interview, for all the work that you have done and obviously are still doing and have no plans to stop doing. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you'd like to talk about before we finish our time today?
I would just say that, you know, I'm pleased at seeing leadership change at Asbury, but I think we have to continue to work hard at bringing new people, younger people into the conversation and into the work and give up some of the ways we've done it before. I think Asbury has to do that. I've seen it at each of those phases in life. I remember conversations and challenges, and we got through them. And I just want us to work hard. And for those of us that believe in our church, in this community, on that corner, work to make that happen. But be willing to bend.
There's still a role for Asbury to play in the history. I've talked to some people who say what a terrible thing it would be if that church was no longer there at the corner of 11th and K, and I think you've just said you feel the same way too. What do you see the church providing to the community?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm learning, so I didn't talk about the fact that I've now, I'm on Wesley Theological Seminary's board, and I followed many Asburyans to go there, and so that was a leadership kind of role. But it's funny, David McAllister Wilson came to visit me a year ago, and I said to him, and you'll appreciate this, our church has finished a strategic plan. We're trying to figure out how to move it forward, and I'm struggling, you know. So I said, maybe I should come back to the seminary board and listen to what's going on in theology and religion to bring back to Asbury. And I've gone back, and I just finished my second year back on the board. And I'm thinking that through because I'm like, you know, this is too valuable of a resource. And it amazes me. I mean, it's kind of sad for me to say this, but, you know, it was a very diverse group of people that came to my father's funeral. And particularly whites would say, oh my gracious, this is a beautiful church. So I believe Asbury will always be a church, but I want it to be a church that respects the history of our founding and the years that we've been there. And I use an example. I vote at a church in my neighborhood right on Calorama and Columbia Road, and we were standing in line for voting, and the neighborhood is basically gentrified, or at least that part of our community. And a white couple was walking, and they saw the picture gallery and they said, this was a black church? And I said, yes, this was a very strong black community at one point. And so I want to make sure that what we've built is always a part of it and not just a photo gallery on the wall, but we have integrated community in our future.
I think that the challenge there as well, and I'd love your thoughts on this, when you're looking economically, it's not just the color of your skin. There is a very wealthy African-American population.
It is.
And so how we define gentrification is also challenging, do you think?
Oh, it is. I mean, I think I said earlier, but, you know, I didn't realize I was gentrifying, you know, the building. It wasn't our community on Belmont Road, but the Valley Vista apartment. There's the Washington Housing Initiative, which is around workforce housing. And I was approached through the Federal City Council that I'm a member of, and I said I wanted to go on that board because of the issues of gentrification. And as I look at what's happening in my neighborhood, and it's all kinds of issues. You know, I live in an apartment building that is not downtown, but not far from downtown. We're between two metro stations, DuPont Circle, and what's the other one? Well, the one right near, well, it's right at Connecticut and Calvert. And Airbnbs, people are renting out apartments. I mean, it's just starting to change the nature of the building we live in and everything. So you're saying, okay, what's going to happen? You look at single family houses that are now 3 and 4 units, and what the impact on parking on the street. And it's like, who's thinking about all this stuff and managing it? So I was in one of the Housing Conservancy meetings, and I said, you know, I want people to know who live in a building what is happening to their building. So I said, you know, in 1977, I moved into the Valley Vista. I had no idea that the city law at that time was that if you were able to increase the rents in your building to a certain level, that then you could convert it to condominium. So when I was shown the remodeled units, I was like, oh, this is very nice. And I moved in, only to find out that I was one of the people who was increasing the rents to put people out of the building. And in that building at that time, most of the older people in the building were white. And it was a mix of races in my age, right out of graduate school, moving in. And so we said, this is a nice place to live. We want to stay here. How do we do that? And so we became a tenant association with the ability to own property. And then we found a developer that would help us to develop the building so that we could stay. And I've been in that building ever since. I've actually bought a second apartment, you know, when I got married so we could stay in the building. But we intentionally thought about it, and we were able to, for the older people who could not buy, we found owners, but they gave them lifetime rights to stay. And so people were able to stay until they passed or they got sick or had to move with family. And so we were able to, we didn't change our building that quickly. I think we have to be intentional in thinking about that. And then how do you help people, different types of people, come together and live in community together? Because many people have not lived with people not like themselves. And so there are articles in the Washington Post now about these kinds of issues. And so we're saying that this group, you know, Federal City Council, you know, the Washington Housing Initiative, we have to intentionally think about these issues and figure out how we work across the community so that people can stay in the city and they can find ways. And we all know when you get to know each other, you realize we're not that different. And so how do you help facilitate those kinds of things?
Because in VPP now, you're also looking at Prince George's County.
We are in Prince George's County. And so when VPP started, and again, you're looking at, we were started in 2000. And so we were started to work with the most vulnerable youth. At that time, most of them were in Washington, D.C., and the nonprofits had developed in Washington, D.C. to serve their needs. But by the time we got to the end of our first fund 5 years later, most of those communities were being disrupted. And so I'll use the example of Mary Center, which is in Columbia Heights or Adams Morgan. And Maria said all of a sudden people weren't in line in the way they were. They were being moved further into Ward 4. They were being moved into Maryland. But she one day saw people started coming back. And she said, why are you coming back? They were coming back because those neighborhoods, Silver Spring, Montgomery County, they didn't have the nonprofits or the services for them. And they said, here's bus fare. Get on the bus and go back down there. And so she started to realize that she had to expand into other parts of the city and into the suburbs. So a lot of our first portfolio work was to help these nonprofits do growth plans to follow the clients that they were serving. And so we looked at 2012, we did what's called the Capital Kids Report. And one of the highlights of the report is they told us what most of us really knew, that the least resources and the most vulnerable youth were in Prince George's County. And so we had to figure out, how do we help in that area? And so we now have a program called Ready for Work, Champions for Career and College Ready Graduates of Prince George's County. And we're in 3 very different communities. We're in Suitland, we're in Oxon Hill, and High Point. And we're working with kids. If we figure if we could get all of those different populations, then we can scale this work to other communities. And so we have found, as I said earlier, that if you get the programs in place and you start to change the ecosystem in the government with the business community. So we have a really good partnership there. We've been working with the school system. We've been working with the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce. We have several businesses that are major partners with us, and we're aligning our resources and our programs and working in a coordinated way rather than a very scattershot way. And Fairfax County, Virginia is interested in us coming there. Now that's one of the most resource parts of our region. They will tell you, we don't lose a lot of kids in school. We don't have a great dropout number, but when we do, we don't have programs to service those kids. And so the same program that we're using in Prince George's can be adapted to that community so that the kids don't fall through the cracks.
People often ask, where are these kids going? If you look at Northeast, and so from what you're saying now, it's what we intuitively believe. They are going down that street, down into Prince George's, and then having to come back here.
That's right. Or you worked with the Boys and Girls Clubs of Greater Washington. They're gone way up. What do they call it? Up county, Montgomery County. They're going up to Gaithersburg, and those are areas that they're just not prepared, and the numbers are doubling and tripling. We call it the suburbanization of poverty. And so how do we help? When the recession hit, we reached out to the nonprofits and we said, how are you all doing? And luckily, most of them were doing well because of the diversified funding that they had learned how to get from our investment in them. But they were telling us that people were coming, people who were working class, working poor. They had new people that were coming, and people were moving around the region to where they found the most resources. So I had a conversation with Kaya Henderson when she was the chancellor, and I said, I really wanted to do our Ready for Work program in DC first, but we're in Prince George's County. She said, Carol, that's not a problem because those kids are my kids. They may live with one parent this year and they're my kid. Next year they're in the county or the families are moving. And so the poor move, or they move where they can get what they need. We find a place to live, we love it, and we pretty much stay there for long periods of time until something in our life changes. They don't live that way. They're very transient. And so we're thinking, how do you have a regional ecosystem that helps to deal with these issues? And
then how do you, as you said earlier, sort of have the conversations that bridge these gaps in culture when these groups of people have to live together? Carol, I've been saying this is the last question for 30 minutes, so I am going to wrap it up now, but again, thank you so much. Thank you for everything, and thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
You're most welcome.